So, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Matt Silverstein, and I am with Antioch University, Los Angeles. At the end of this podcast, we'll be telling you more about a couple of classes, online classes that Dr. Brewster will be leading that will be open to the public if you want to drop in. And you need to contact us at sdp.aola@antioch.edu for more information. We'll take that up at the end as well. Right now, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Brewster and her incredible work. Dr. Fanny Brewster is a Jungian analyst and author of poetry and nonfiction. Her books include African Americans and Jungian Psychology, Leaving the Shadows, which was published in 2017 by Routledge. And she has also published Archetypal Grief, Slavery's Legacy of Intergenerational Child Loss, and that was in 2018. And most recently, she's published The Racial Complex, a Jungian Perspective on Culture and Race. Her poems from Journey, The Middle Passage have appeared in Psychological Perspectives Journal, in which she was the featured poet. Dr. Brewster is a core faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute and the Philadelphia Association of Jungian Analysts. She is an international lecturer and workshop presenter on Jungian psychology-related topics. So today we're going to talk particularly about what's going on in the world and how to maybe understand specifically the coronavirus pandemic and underlying racial conditions, the impact to communities of color, perhaps particularly from a depth psychological perspective. And we'll see. And we're going to just have a conversation here and kind of see what comes up, but that's kind of, in a way, a starting place. So I wanted to maybe just make a space for Dr. Brewster to say hello and maybe just to kind of get us started. And I feel so privileged to be in this conversation with you, and so welcome the perspective that you're bringing. So thanks so much for doing this today.
Yes, you're welcome, Matt. I'm really happy to be here and to join you in having this discussion. You know, we've spoken on different occasions together about depth psychology and specifically Jungian psychology. And so we share language, we share ideas. And so this podcast is a good experience. I think it adds to how we've been with one another in our conversations. Like, this is a different format for us to be engaging in. So it feels it's different, and yet it's familiar because we've talked several times before. So it feels good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess just based on our conversations in the past, I would just wonder really what's on your mind in this moment about the pandemic and kind of just how it's touching you, your life, your community, and your work, and just your thoughts about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really, it goes straight to my heart, you know, what's been happening with the coronavirus. And, you know, as I speak to colleagues and friends, I work with my patients, it's like looking at the virus from their perspective and also feeling my own heartfelt sadness and rage and fear. Like there's so many different emotions, and they can happen within a minute, changing, moving and shifting. I was talking to a friend one day, and it came to me this image of, slides. Maybe this is so old school, but, the slides with the projector. And it just feels like emotionally, not like a roller coaster so much, but just these slides like shifting, and like someone pushes a button and a different slide appears up on the wall or up on the screen, like, a remembrance of some kind. Like I woke up one morning, and the first image that came to me was of my father, who died several years ago. And I got this image of him in the casket at the funeral service. And I think that, death is so present in our consciousness now. And I honestly don't think that we've even begun to really grieve in the way that we will, because we're in the beginning of this. I do believe it's in the beginning. And so we have so much more to come emotionally, but there's still all of these, I think, fragments and slides that keep going past of memories, of emotions, of ideas about how we could be better and how we could heal, and where's the vaccine, and why is it going to take a year and a half, and is it going to take a year and a half, and who's going to get it first? Am I going to ever get it? It's like, will I live that long? So I think I'm not different than many others who are having these conversations, about the pandemic that we're in the midst of. And so many of us have had it now, have had this virus, and so many of us are still dying from it. And, part of what we were going to talk about today was looking at the ethnic makeup of those who have had the greatest deaths within, a range of people who have died. And it's really hit the people of color communities really hard. And so that's something that, we're going to talk about today. But also looking at what's happened as best you and I can, because you're a depth psychologist, I'm a depth psychologist, like looking at that through the lens of depth psychology. And what are we seeing? What are we viewing? How do we look at this pandemic, this virus, through that perspective? And maybe we'll be making some of this up as we go along. And that's okay, because we are imaginal people and we work in an imaginal way through archetypal psychology. So we want to be able to not lose that part of the lens also.
Yeah, still getting used to technology and communicating in this way primarily. And so many of us are, communicating primarily at a distance and through technology if we're lucky enough to have access to it. I'm wondering about depth psychology, and sort of if you could talk for a moment about what, if anything, depth psychology brings to the situation and helps us think about regarding illness and regarding the uncertainty that's present and the trauma of loss that is that's accumulating, as you say, and it's going to maybe have to get taken up down the line even when things, if ever, kind of settle down. But what does depth psychology bring that maybe is a starting place, at least to think about things a little bit differently than maybe a lot of people are used to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for us, as we think about depth psychology, with any kind of sickness that happens, like we're thinking, I believe, from that first, it's like a premise, depth psychology, that the remedy is in the poison, right? The remedy is in the poison. That's how we start. And if we start from that perspective, I think it can decrease our level of fear. but it also gives us like the possibility of how we can do the healing. So when we think about this virus and we think about what's happened, it's all over the world. It hasn't isolated itself in one location. It's not a Chinese virus, right? Like we have to let go of segregating ourselves in terms of thinking, right? Like only it's only held in one particular spot. No, depth psychology says everything is everywhere, and so are all the possibilities. So when we think about the healing, we're thinking about all kinds of possibilities for healing, right? So the healing is of the mind, the healing is of the spirit, the healing is of the soul, the healing is of the physical body. Like, how does that happen, right? And also, I think tied in with that, there's a way in which, like homeopathy, right? Like when you have a remedy, when you get a remedy, the body becomes more intensely open to whatever the quote unquote illness is, whatever the poison is. The body becomes more acclimated to it as if it has to pass through it. And so that's a part of that psychological thinking. There's no avoiding what is happening. There's no avoiding the experience of the poison. Like the poison is there. And so we have to see it, we recognize it. And I'm thinking a little bit aside of this in our collective, like thinking about the political and the socioeconomic way in which our society, American society, can be poisoned. And I think that leads to the way so many people of color have actually gotten this virus because of socioeconomic issues, racial relations that underlie what's happened with it. So I think in going back, completing this circle of thought about this, depth psychology says that there are so many ways in which we must consider poison as well as healing, and that those two are tied together, that there's no separation of them. And so we can't cut something off, cut some part of our thinking off and make it, for example, in this case, a Chinese virus. We can't cut it off and make it like, this sickness or illness belongs only to gay people, which we went through with AIDS, or it started with Black people. It's their illness. It belongs to them. Like depth psychology, I think true depth psychological thinking is that it belongs to all of us, every part of our thinking, every part of our body, to everyone, to the collective. It's not segregated. So I think that's how I think of it, And so I think that this remedy that's going to come is because not just my perspective on my body and keeping my body healthy, but what about my cultural group and what about the collective as a whole? How do we allow for individuals who need masks and who need protective equipment and gear to go out and do their jobs? How do we allow for them to have that? For example, sending workers back into meat places where they prepare food is not, and there's like hundreds of them. How is that good for us as a society to say, yes, let's send them back. Let's just get them back to work and get the economy going. And those are predominantly people of color. How do we send them back without the protection they need with no vaccine available? That's not to me like thinking about us consciously or thinking about us in terms of wholeness or in a good way of healing the poison. Because I think a part of the poison there is this idea that there will be collateral damage. And so we allow for that to happen, but the people that are getting damaged or considered, or actually not considered, are those who are essential workers. Those are the ones who we're sending back to the front lines all the time and saying, yes, go back. We need our food. We cannot have the food chain broken, the food supply chain. But what about them? What about their protection? What about their families? And what about actually ending this virus in a way as best we can without letting people die and saying where they're just collateral damage? Because I do think that that's a part of the unconscious reasoning that's pushing for an opening, a reopening of our society when it's not ready yet.
So I'm just slowing down with the idea of the poison also being the remedy in this instance. And I think for a lot of us, that's kind of a new turn, right? Particularly if we're thinking about something like a viral epidemic. And you're also talking about the poison, not only at this physical, biological level, but you're talking about the poison as a kind of a cultural unconsciousness and cultural shadow, if we will, or cultural unconscious violence that is getting connected up with the pandemic in a particular way. And it's as if these different facets of the poison are related in some way. And could you connect the dots a little bit there? Because I think that's really interesting and an important way of thinking about what's happening holistically. But right, most of us, including in the media, that's not really how things are put together. That's not the story. It's as if we need to kind of, hit the target of the virus even, and then that's ultimately what's going to be the remedy. But you're talking about it a little bit differently than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think because as there's some people that are talking about this, in American society and in the American psyche, we are dealing with racial relations. That is just a fact of how we live together. And so based on that, when we consider the language, some of the language that's come out of talking about this pandemic, like placing it as a Chinese virus to start with, right? So in a way that goes directly to this idea of the poisoning of racism. Like racism is a poison, right? It really is. And we are still dealing with it. And Jung, decades ago talked about a color complex. So the book that I wrote, The Racial Complex, is trying to bring that work forward so that we can have more of an open discussion about how we really think about one another, to have dialogues about our complexes. What is this unconscious material that we as individually and as collectives live with? For example, there was a young man, Aubrey, in Georgia, who was killed in February. It has become an international story. It's not unique because African American men get killed seemingly at random, but we know it's specific because of their ethnicity. I don't say race, we're all one race, because of their ethnicity. So I would ask, what is the poison in our unconscious selves, perhaps through complexes, through a racial complex that allows for something to happen, that allows for him to be killed by two white men with shotguns, right? He's harmless. He has no weapons. He's out running. So we see the poison of, I believe, racism active in that experience. And that's not one instance in time. This is repeated over and over and over again. So then the underpinning of the virus we see has affected people of color in an extremely large way, right? What is the poison in the society that allows for it to be that most of the people that get to stay home are not people of color? They're the ones going out and, like I said before, on the front lines doing these jobs. Right? So is that not reflective of some kind of unconscious thinking that is embedded in racism, that perhaps has to do with racial complexes, that has to do with how we treat one another and how we live, based on economics also? I mean, I could talk about redlining, right? Like talking about that as a way of segregating us, and based on housing and money. I think it still happens. That's still happening. And we see it by the number of people in the communities of color that are still dying. So what is the poison? To me, the poison there is an unconscious racism that affects us, and it's become so blatant that we see it all the time. We see it all the time, but a lot of times we want to push it back. We push it into shadow. You mentioned the word shadow. We push it there because we can't tolerate it. And now with these numbers and what's going on, you can't deny it. You cannot deny it.